a little bit unstable. I just responded to an email thread about that again. So if that affects you, you'll be aware of that. For the other teams, as far as I know, I have no reason to believe that there are any further issues. In case I'm missing something there, let me know, either by email, forum, or if you prefer here in the chat window. So the team allocation, except the team that I just emailed, I believe is fairly stable. You should also all have received invites to the Slack instance that we're using for this course. If you haven't accepted these invites yet, please do so soon, because otherwise we can't put you in the channel that is the channel for your team. I think we have about 8 students that hadn't accepted the invites yet, so please check your email if you've received an invite. If you don't think you've received an invite, again, let me know and we'll sort that out. What else? For the project, or for the teams that suggested that are planning to work on the TypeScript JavaScript project, Zettler, please have a look at the announcement that I posted yesterday morning. The project maintainer had a lot of good ideas of what potential issues you could work on. Turns out the help wanted ones were not where his priorities are at the moment, but the message here contains lots of links for things for you to look at. That's of course only relevant if you're one of the 5 teams, I believe, that are working or planning to work on the Zettler project. Okay, the last thing that I was gonna talk about in terms of admin things is the survey to select this one here, right? The survey to select which task your team wants to work on. I haven't received responses from all teams yet, so maybe I can just open it up to questions here. Is there, I'll have the chat window open here as well. Was there anything unclear about that survey? And if so, I'll be happy to answer any questions or post clarifications. So the purpose of that survey that I've linked twice in the announcements now is that every team should select 3 issues. Okay, I see a question come in. I'll answer that in a second. So every team should select 3 issues from the project that they've already selected, 3 issues that they think they would like or could work on. You will only be required to work on one of those, but I'm asking for 3 because there's no point in having different teams work on the same issue. As you'll understand, open source projects will only be able to accept, at most one pull request with the same functionality. So if multiple teams work on fixing a particular bug, only one of the pull requests at most will be accepted. So there's really no point in multiple teams working on the same issue. So that's why I'm asking for your top 3 choices, and then once I have responses from everyone, I'll do the assignment of issues to teams. So I see there's one question in the chat so far. Is there an expected size for the issue to be solved? Very good question. Issues are of course difficult to estimate in terms of size. What I am looking for is a source code contribution. As we said in the lectures now a few times, there's a lot of contributions you could make to open source projects that have nothing to do with source code. So, documentation, translation, and whatnot. For this course, it would be really good to make a source code contribution. Ideally, it shouldn't be a one-liner, although I realize that without having a temp to solve the issue, you might not actually know whether it will be a one-liner just yet. But it should definitely be something that you think within your team you can realistically solve within the time frame of this course. And I see there's another question. I'll answer that shortly. The other thing I'm just going to mention is that the size of the issue should be something that you're confident to solve before the end of the semester, because we still want to give the open source project a bit of time to actually respond um, to respond um, to to the pull requests via code review. So it would be a good idea to be able to submit your pull requests maybe in early May. Then the open source project would have about a month to respond to you, and then you can make changes based on the responses and so on to really have the best chance of getting your pull requests merged. So look for something that you think your team can solve within a 1 month's time window. I think that would give us a good timeline for this. Okay. Next question. I'm a part of the group that chose a different project from the three presented. Would we have to fill out the survey? Good question. I don't think so. No, because you chose a Rust project, so you could could just pick any issue from that Rust project, and at least no student in this team will compete in this class will compete with you. So Matthew, no, your group doesn't need to fill out the survey. That's fine. I got a private question here whether I can mention the names along with the student ID so we can contact each other. I don't think I need to do that because you know that you can email each other just based on your student IDs, right? So if you put a student number at student.adelaide.edu.au, then you can email each other. So just the information from the student ID should be enough. For privacy concerns, I'm also not really able, or at least I shouldn't publish lists of student IDs and student names publicly on the internet. So sorry, Puneet, I'm not going to do that, but based on the student ID itself, you should be able to email your team members. You should all have 2 University of Adelaide email addresses, one with your name, with your student ID. To the best of my knowledge, they all end up in the same inbox. Is there any concern if people outside of this subject solve the same issue while we work on it? Good question. 2 things that I'm going to say with respect to that. The first one is, once you start working on the issue, it would be a good idea, and I'll post that as an announcement once we're at that stage. It will be a good idea to leave a comment on the issue and saying that you're currently working on that, so then the whole open source community knows that you're currently working on that. And you know, it doesn't guarantee that nobody else will attempt to solve the same bug or whatever you chose to work on. But at least it gives, you know, a little bit more of a certainty that that's not going to happen. So once you know which task you'll be working on, which again I'll assign once every team has filled in that survey, then I would recommend, and I'll post that as an announcement later, I would recommend to leave a comment on the issue saying that you know, we're a team of students, University of Adelaide, if you'd like to say that, and we're planning to work on this, expect a pull request within the next month, something like that. The other thing I'm going to say is that whether the pull request is accepted or not will not directly affect your mark. So I realize that pull requests get rejected for all sorts of random reasons. It could be that somebody else fixed the bug and you didn't know somebody else was working on it, even though you said you were working on it. It could just happen, right? So I can't, you know, give you a bad mark because of that. Same thing, you know, some open source projects might just not like student contributions. For the 3 projects that I've recommended, I've been in touch with all the maintainers. They know student contributions are about to arrive. They look forward to them. But still, there's no guarantee that, you know, it's not going to be rejected for some random reason. So pull request success directly will not affect your mark. Of course, indirectly, if the pull request was rejected because you didn't respond to code review comments, or because you, I don't know, sent it to the wrong branch, or you didn't actually fix the bug, then that's of course something that I will be looking at. But if there's a very good explanation why the pull request was not accepted, then you could still get full marks for this course. So the advice there would be, once you know which issue you're working on, leave a comment on the issue saying that your team is working on this and when you think you might have a pull request ready. And 2, even if somebody else were to solve the same task at the same time, that's not going to negatively affect your mark. Okay, the last question that I see there, should we start to communicate via the Slack channel? Sure, the Slack channel should be ready, so yes, feel free to go ahead and use those. As you know, as part of the course, we will be looking at your Slack communication for assessment, that it's different of the assessment component, so we'll be making sure that sort of the name of Slack was software. Okay, now I can't remember what it all stood for, but it's basically a repository of all the knowledge and all the communication. That was the C and the K, all the knowledge and the communication relevant to the software project. So what we'll be looking at for assessment with regard to the Slack channels is that all important decisions are documented in your Slack channels, so that you and somebody else could always go back to that and figure out why you decided to do something which way, why you decided to respond to code review comments this way, why you decided to tackle the issue in this particular branch, and so on. So all of these decisions should ideally be documented on your Slack channel. Yeah, and since you have received the invites to the Slack channel now, everybody who has accepted should be in their team's channel now. Feel free to start using that. If you have any other questions related to the Slack channels, let me know. Of course, that also comes back to the question how to contact each other, since you only have each other's student IDs, or you have been assigned to Slack channels now, so that would also be an excellent place to start the communication. So yeah, just a reminder, fill out the survey that we're looking at the moment on the screen. As soon as you do that, as soon as all teams have done that, I'll be able to assign issues to different teams, and we can all start working on making contributions to those projects. And yeah, Jabref, Settler, and Pigments, all of the maintainers know that your contributions will be coming. They all know that around 5 teams have signed up for each of these projects. They are looking forward to them. They have told me that they are generally pretty good at providing quick feedback on pull requests. Let's hope that's actually true. But yeah, if you get your pull requests in like by early May, then I think we'll be in really good shape. Okay, is there anything else in terms of administrative issues that I wanted to talk about? I can't think of anything else right now in terms of admin things. Any other questions from your side? By the way, the reason that I'm getting you to choose tasks to contribute to is that I believe that's a really important skill in contributing to open source projects, to be able to identify open issues in existing projects that you think are possible to handle in particular time window with particular number of team members. Maybe one thing regarding teams, was a bit surprised how many emails I got with requests to change teams, especially since I allowed you to pick your own teams. as part of the course, of course, there's absolutely no requirement that all students need to be in the same time zone or anything like that. In fact, for those of you who will go into software industry after your degrees, you'll find that a lot of your team members will not be in the same time zone. So, remote working is part of being a software engineer. As of now, I think we're still on track of having short proposal presentations in week 5. So once we know which issues are going to be worked on by which teams, you should be able then to put together a short proposal presentation telling me what you're planning to contribute to and sort of what are the steps and time for your contribution, those proposal presentations will make up a small part of your final marks, 10%, I believe, but they will also give me the opportunity to give feedback to see if what you're proposing makes sense. All right, that was a lot of admin issues. Any other admin related questions? Otherwise, we can start switching to the actual lecture content. Okay, don't see anything else here. Okay, except for some Slack notifications. All right, then let me open this thing, make the chat window smaller again. Right, the other thing I can mention is that on Wednesday morning we'll have a guest lecture. I'll have a guest lecture by a researcher whose main research area is investigating how newcomers get started in open source projects. So hopefully we'll be able to learn something from that as well. Okay, but then let's get started with the lecture content. We have about half an hour left. Put the participants at the bottom here. Okay, so what I was going to talk about today was if you were to start your own open source projects, what are some of the challenges and pitfalls to watch out for? What's some advice on how to successfully run an open source project? As we learned, for example, from the case study on Linux on Wednesday, open source projects typically start small but grow very quickly if it worked well. Many open source projects, they start with this burst of enthusiasm by one person, right? You have a specific idea for a software library, a tool, or something like that you think will be really useful. You develop it, you make it available on GitHub, you hope that other people will start sending contributions, and then you sort of run out of enthusiasm, right? You make it publicly available, and then you don't have time for it anymore, and so nobody really looks after it, because that's the second point on the slide there, because very few projects and their maintainers actually think about what's involved in running a successful open source project. Right, so that's sort of the theory and practice. Things to decide when you start your own open source project, sort of course, where you want to go with it. And that doesn't have to be the final plan, and it rarely, is the plan that's going to work out exactly. So you don't want to have, goals that are too big. And as we saw last week, even Linus Torvalds, who started the Linux kernel, didn't really have the idea that this was going to be a really important operating system kernel running on a lot of different platforms. But what he knew at the beginning was that it was an operating system kernel with specific features that he was interested in. As you start, making your own project available as open source, you probably want to have a fairly simple structure. You want to be able to still keep track of all incoming pull requests by yourself, and a fairly simple contribution mechanism to attract other people to it, but also not to scare them away with too much bureaucracy. Something important to decide when you start your own open source project is what kind of license you want. The general advice is you should not invent your own license, because then people won't really uh, have the time to read all the details and try to understand what that means. But there are lots of existing licenses out there. You will talk about that, I think, in the prac this week as well. There are all sorts of websites that help you with picking the right license for a new open source project. And sort of some of the biggest differences between different licenses are to what extent other people can use and change the software, and in particular the software, once they change it, also needs to be open source. So in my experience, that's sort of the biggest differentiator there. Some licenses you can modify, and then possibly you can modify the project and possibly even sell it for money. With other licenses, any modification also needs to be open source, which often makes these sorts of projects less attractive to commercial software companies. When you decide to have a new open source project, you have to make some decisions around, what source code management to use. Do you want to use GitHub? Do you want to have a mailing list, Slack channel, IRC channel, website? How will you track bugs and so on? A lot of these decisions have gotten a bit easier now that GitHub is really popular. Maybe just to emphasize again, there are open source projects out there that are not on GitHub. GitHub probably has most of them, but there are still some other sites out there, Bitbucket, GitLab, SourceForge, even though that's starting not be so popular anymore, where you can host your project as well. Another important piece of advice if you start your own open source project is to start with something that actually works, people can use. So, if you just see an empty open source project saying that, I'm planning to develop a prototype for this, it doesn't look very concrete and you might not be interested in contributing to that. But if there's like an initial working prototype, then you can start reporting bugs, you can request additional features, and you can start making all sorts of contributions to them. To the extent possible, you probably want to follow common conventions. So if there's another project that does something similar to what you're planning to do, maybe just copy some of their templates as a starting point. Have a similar way for reporting bugs, similar way of handling maybe even things like source code formatting and so on. First impressions matter, and I'm not sure to what extent you've experienced that in this course so far, because I've given you 3 specific open source projects as starting points. But if I had left it completely open to you, how would you decide based on millions of projects on GitHub? How would you decide which one to make a contribution to? Likely based on the first impression, right? You probably don't have time to look at in detail at millions of open source projects to figure out which one is actually good, which one might actually be friendly to newcomers, and so on. You likely decide based on the very first impression of the README file on the cover page of GitHub. So first impressions matter. Something that is quite common, I think, in the open source community is that you're open sourcing existing code, right? So often the starting point is not necessarily an empty GitHub repository. Often the starting point is that you have some existing project already, and that could be the case for you as well. If you have like a really nice course project from one of your previous courses that you think is so good that maybe other people want to contribute to, that's something you could open source and then spread out the development and maintenance effort. So that's something that we also do often at the university. If we have a nice research prototype that we think is worth maintaining, but we don't have the resources to maintain the prototype ourselves, we make it available as open source, hope that some people fork it and get some additional use out of it. something to watch out for. So cleanliness of code, sure, that's always something to watch out for. But again, also the choice of license. So if the existing project was developed as part of a university course, for example, at least at this university, you would have the IP, and therefore you could decide to make it available as open source. But in many cases, it's not that straightforward, right? Even as part of a university course, you may have worked with an industry partner and maybe even signed an NDA or something like this. So then the ownership of the code is much less obvious, and you would have to look at the paperwork. Are you actually allowed to make that code available as open source? Yes or no? And often it's not the source code itself that's tricky, but it's, data that might also be in the repository or something like that might actually, you might not be allowed to make available as open source. So yeah, before uploading random stuff to GitHub, always think about, are you actually allowed to do that? Chances are, if it's your own project, maybe developed for the university or for a university course, you are allowed to make it available without any restrictions. But as soon as there are additional parties involved, it's something worth thinking about. Right, so we talked about that. Right? If parts of the code base are owned by others, then it starts with all sorts of more tricky situation there. There's something also to consider with regard to patents. So if it's been available as open source for a particular amount of time, you might not be able to apply for a patent anymore because it's become part of the general knowledge base. Trade secrets, trademarks, build process requirement, contractual requirements. Hopefully doesn't apply to too many university projects, but later on, if you decide to make source code available as open source, it's something to think about. Maybe one example that I encountered recently, we're currently working with the Defense Science and Technology Group here in Adelaide on a particular software project in the space of natural language processing. Got a small grant for a student to work on this over the summer, and the student was generally happy to do that. We paid him a salary, that was good. But the student also wanted to make sure that he could make this contribution available on his GitHub profile, because he wanted to use it, well, sure, to make some money over the summer, but in addition also to build up his expertise and show off that expertise on GitHub to show that, look, I've developed this project, I now have expertise in natural language processing and in all these programming languages and data sources in this case as well. So we did the right thing. We had this conversation with the Defense Science and Technology Group before we started the project. Are we allowed to make that code available as open source? In this case, we were. But yeah, if you're interested in making things available as open source, not just to give back to the open source community. I mean, it's great if that's your reason, but I realize that's not the only reason. But it might also just be a way of building up your GitHub profile, right? Future employers might want to take a look at your GitHub profile to verify that you're actually familiar with all these programming languages that you claim on your CV. So when you start a new project, make sure that you would be able to open source it if you so wish. Obviously, contributions in this course can be open sourced. Right, so when you decide to start a new open source project, some of the things you need to decide are what infrastructure to use. Source code, I think we talked about that. Why is this on the slide again? I don't know. Right, so lots of things to decide. It's often not just the source code management system itself, but it's also where do you want to deploy a running prototype. So that gets us into areas such as continuous integration, continuous deployment. If you have, if the project that you'd like to open source is a nice web application, the best way to attract other contributors to it is if you can actually show them a link where they can test your web application and take a look at it. That then brings up the question, where would you want to host that? Do you want to have your own domain, and so on? Because there are so many projects on GitHub, so many open source projects on GitHub, millions, just putting a project on GitHub is probably not going to give you a lot of contributors to start with. You probably need some sort of marketing strategy, some sort of publicity plan. You probably want to announce that this project exists now, or you might want to make sure that your project is listed on some registry. It depends on what kind of project it is, of course. If it's let's say it's a plugin for Google Chrome. Let's say you developed a nice plugin for Google Chrome. Well, make sure it's available on the Google Chrome Marketplace, or whatever that thing is called, right? The place where you can download extensions to the browser, for example. The same thing, of course, for a mobile app. You want to make sure that it's listed on the marketplace. But often there are other websites as well that just keep lists of applications that solve particular problems. And it can be as simple as Wikipedia, right? Maybe if you have a really nice prototype to solve a particular task, you can actually go to the relevant Wikipedia article and add yourself to the list there. And hopefully the editors of Wikipedia think it's an important enough project to keep it there. And there are often mailing lists related to particular technologies. You don't want to spam every list, of course. Social media can be a good place for this as well. So the point here is that just putting some source code on GitHub in most cases will not get you contributors just yet, but there's many things that you can do in terms of advertising it a little bit to the community. Right, in these announcements, you of course want to talk about what it is. What is it for? What's the programming language? What's the license, and so on. Then the next thing is, once you've announced the project and you're starting to gather some interest, you want to make sure that you provide positive feedback really quickly to anybody who's interested in the project. And that's something that as part of the course you'll sort of experience from the other end, right? So you've all chosen to in your teams make a contribution to a particular open source project. A bad experience would be if you put your pull request together, fix the bug, all good, provide all the test cases, pass all the tests, and then nobody responds to your pull request, right? That's just a really bad experience. You put in all this work to of your volunteered time to make a contribution to an open source project, and then you never hear back. Obviously, this is very likely then your last attempt to contribute to this particular project, and might even be your last attempt to contribute to open source in general, because you'll just be disappointed by this experience. So that's something that, of course, as part of the course we're trying to avoid, but also something that from the other side you would want to avoid if you're running your own open source project, which is again why we selected these particular 3 projects for your open source contributions for this course, because I've been in touch with the maintainers to try to avoid any problems in that direction. Okay. In many areas of software development now, people have gotten used to really frequent releases. So when you don't update the apps on your phone for 2 days, then half of them are going to be out of date already. Maybe not half, but surprisingly many. So if you want to keep a community interested in your open source project, you probably want to be able to announce something fairly on a fairly regular basis. Right, so you want to release new features, have snapshot releases if need be, even if they aren't perfectly stable. You want to post a summary and so on, and just encourage discussion around what's going on with the project. things to start considering if the project's really successful and keeps growing. Do you want to package the project for major distributions, for example, major operating systems or major mobile platforms? Do you want to do a binary packages? Actually, that's probably also a good way of getting users to use open source projects. So, especially for people who've never contributed to open source, it can always be a bit of a hurdle to use an open source project because it sort of comes with this expectation that you need to download the source code and you need to build it and compile it, and who knows what's going to happen if it doesn't build and compile. So then you might not be happy to use it anymore if just getting it to run is complicated. So one way to overcome this is to also make an executable version available on the project website, for example. Okay, and you can write articles about it. There's many blog posts announcing open source projects or announcing new features in open source projects. As projects continue to grow, at some point you probably want to think about, do you want to continue to be the main person behind this project, or do you want to pass on the leadership to somebody else? Do you want to formalize who's in charge of what? Maybe you want, one person who's in charge of the testing, another person in charge of deployment or something like that, and maybe you even want to sort of have less responsibility yourself and assign the main maintenance responsibility to somebody else. Some open source projects, and I guess we saw the Linux kernel as an example last week, can grow really quickly. So in that case, it's really important to make those decisions early and to make them well. Otherwise there's just simply too much load on one person. If you have like any reasonable sized open source project, it's impossible to keep track of all pull requests as one person, unless it's your full-time job, and for many open source contributors it's not. So in some cases it might make sense to actually break the project into modules, so then you have different people in charge of different modules. You might be able to use even separate mailing lists for different parts and so on. Is that a chat question here? No. Right. If you're really successful, you can even start having a little conference. And actually, at least one of the projects that I have suggested you contribute to, JabRef, they have their own mini conference. So they also started small, with a small open source project, have gotten bigger and bigger over time, and by now they do have, I think, yearly conferences where all the contributors to the project are invited to get together. Okay, for the last few minutes I wanted to give you a little preview in simple rules for helping newcomers become contributors to open source projects. I don't have the link on the slide, I just realized. But let me just open it up to any more questions, maybe from the chat. I don't see any at the moment. Okay, let's assume that there aren't any admin related questions or any other questions for the moment then. And I shall post the link to the work about the simple rules for helping newcomers become contributors to open source projects after the lecture. But yeah, let me use the remaining 10 minutes to start going through this. So a really important point if you want to have a successful open source project is, of course, that you need other people to be involved, right? You can't run a really big open source project just by yourself. So you must be able to attract new members to the project so that they try to make their own contribution, and ideally even retain new members and help them to be productive, help them develop their own skills. And I think that's probably partly why the 3 open source projects that we'll be working with as part of this course, why they are interested in in contributions from you as part of the course. For one, of course, there's the hope that you might be able to fix bugs or might be able to implement a particular feature. But there's also the hope that, if you find the project really interesting, if you find it useful to have these contributions under your own GitHub profile, then maybe you want to stay involved and, contribute more to the projects even after and outside of university. Openness is a really big point in the open source community, as the name would suggest, I guess. And yeah, I don't think I want to go into the related work there too much right now, but there has been a lot of work, not just in computer science and in software engineering, on how to attract people to communities. In this case, communities that develop software together, but a lot of the ideas that I'm talking about here apply to other fields and other communities as well. What's typically referred to as a community of practice is something that we see in open source. Communities of practice are groups of participants that have a common product or a purpose that they work on or towards. They are mutually engaged, so they assist and mentor each other. Hopefully we'll see that as part of the code review process in particular, and they will develop shared resources and domain knowledge. So a big open source project, if it has more than a couple contributors, sort of becomes its own community of practice, which means these communities sometimes shape their own rules, how to contribute, how to organize the project, and so on. Community of effort, but let's actually get to the 10 rules that I wanted to talk about. The first rule to running an attractive open source project, one that can attract and retain newcomers, is simply that be welcoming. As I mentioned already, it's often the first impression that decides whether you find an open source project interesting to contribute to or not, right? If you can't figure out after 5 minutes what's the easiest way of contributing source code to this, you're not going to stay around, and 5 minutes is probably already a really long time for that. So be welcoming is one of them. I'm going to go through these slides fairly quickly. I'd rather cover the 10 rules in the remaining few minutes than go into all of them in detail. The slides are available on MyUni if you'd like to go through it at a somewhat slower pace. You also want to help potential contributors evaluating if a project is a good fit for them. So you want to make it easy for potential contributors to see what skill profile they would need to be able to make a successful contribution to the project. So, to some extent, GitHub helps with that by at least showing you very clearly what are the programming languages in a particular project. But there's a bit more to that. Do you need UI skills? Do you need database skills? Do you need any specific skills to make a contribution to a particular project? Make the governance explicit. So it's always good to at least have, for example, an email address at the end of the README file where you can get in touch with the main person of a project, if there is a main person of the project. If there are multiple main people of the project, maybe make a link to the mailing list available, something like that. So make it explicit who somebody could contact if they have private questions about the project that they don't just want to post as an issue, for example, or if there are any other concerns. So make it sort of explicit who's in charge, if it is one person who's in charge. As we talked about, I think last Monday probably, not all open source projects necessarily have that one person in charge. Keep knowledge up to date and findable. That's a challenge in every software project. That's partly why I'll be looking at your Slack communication to make sure that at least within the course project, we keep knowledge and communication up to date. As you will have seen in other projects, no matter whether open source or not, software documentation tends to be outdated very quickly and tends to not be in sync with the actual source code. Obviously, that's something that makes it harder for newcomers to contribute. And I think that will be something that you have to keep in mind as you make your own contributions to open source projects as part of the course. There's no guarantee that the documentation that you see related to these open source projects is actually up to date. That's, of course, not an open source specific problem. That's sadly a problem in the software industry in general. Have and enforce a code of conduct. In an ideal world, we wouldn't have to talk about that. But as you will also know, on the internet, there's always this one person who misbehaves and might actually troll other people. The worst thing that you can do to a newcomer if they submit a pull request is leave some troll comments making fun of their code quality or something like that. So that should never happen. And a good open source project will have and also enforce a code of conduct and make sure that things like that do not happen or are have consequences. For example, by actually blocking people from accessing the project communication any further. Develop forms of legitimate peripheral participation. Not all potential contributors to an open source project want to contribute source code. Some of them might be happy just to translate something, update the documentation, organize events for the community. So if you want to keep those people involved, it's good to offer them something as well and not look down on them because they don't want to write source code, for example. Make it easy for newcomers to get started. Many good open source projects have separate documentation files on how to make contributions. Hopefully contributions particularly, or hopefully these contribution guides are particularly useful for newcomers. All of the projects that I suggested to make contributions to as part of this course label at least some of their issues with this is where we want help, or these issues are particularly good for newcomers. So that's a good way of making it a bit easier for newcomers to get started. Use opportunities for in-person interaction. As with any online community with open source projects, it would be nice if sometimes you can meet people in person. Sadly, in particular, difficult these days with the pandemic. But if you only communicate electronically, only via assigning issues to each other or responding to each other's pull requests, you can't really establish the same kind of connection with somebody as if you have at least some audio and video chats every once in a while. So for big open source projects, that can become necessary at some points. Acknowledge all contributors. That's something that traditionally the open source community is really good at. You'll see that at least for JabRef, I can't speak for the other two projects I suggested right now, but at least JabRef, if you make any contribution, no matter how small it will be, you will be listed as one of their contributors in their next, I think, monthly release. So open source projects tend to be really good at acknowledging everything that was contributed to them. And the last point, follow up on both success and failure. So if somebody sent you a really good pull request and you've never heard from them again, that could be actually a way of following up and seeing if they would like to contribute more. Or if they submitted a pull request that was not so good, that's the opportunity to respond to them with a really good code review and telling them what they can change to make their pull request better. And I really hope that the 3 projects that I chose for this course will be doing that to you. So now if you submit a pull request that's not perfect at first, and very few pull requests are perfect at first, then hopefully you'll get back really good code review comments that you can respond to and make your contribution even better. Okay, I think we've reached the end of today. Just open the chat window again. I don't see any other questions. But yeah, just a reminder again for each team to fill in the survey with which issues you'd like to work on as part of your team projects. And you will, in the end, only work on one of the issues that you suggest. I'm asking for more so that we can ensure that no two teams are working on the same issues. Okay, I don't see other questions for now. Lecture recording will be available on MyUni later today. The slides should already be there. And then I'll see you again on Wednesday morning. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks.